since the 1990s, interest in his practical intelligence has declined precipitously, because when it is matched head-to-head with standard IQ intelligence, the IQ intelligence eats up all the variability. What's really happened, as far as I can tell so far, is that when we're trying to predict people's course through life, IQ does a very good job, and then one of the traits does a very good job as well, which is conscientiousness. But it doesn't do as good a job as IQ. Now that partly might be because we can't measure conscientiousness very well. We're stuck with self-reports, or maybe I could gather peer reports about you, or I could gather your parents' reports about your teachers' reports, and each of those seems to pick up a little bit more of the pattern, because you know yourself, but other people know you differently than you know yourself, and there's still some accuracy in that. You can get multiple rater reports of something like conscientiousness, and that'll up its predictive validity. But in the final analysis, the best you seem to be able to do with conscientiousness is about a 0.4 correlation with long-term performance, whereas with IQ, in complex jobs, you can probably get 0.5 and maybe 0.6. And so 0.5 is 25% of the variance, you got to square it. 0.6 is 36% of the variance, and 0.4 is 16% of the variance. So even at the low end, let's say high end for conscientiousness is 0.4 or 16%. Low end for IQ is 0.5 or 25%. Low end estimates of IQ make it 1.5 times more powerful than the high end estimates of conscientiousness. And I think that's about right. You'd think, why do we even have to debate this? And because it's so bloody obvious to me that intelligence is a major predictor of life success. I mean, you people, I've measured the IQ of University of Toronto people. You know, people in this room who have an IQ of less than 120 are rare. Well, why? Well, smart people go to university. Now, is that actually a contentious statement? Well, it shouldn't be a contentious statement. It's self-evident. Universities were actually set up so that smart people could expand their abilities. That's why they were there. And you're selected on the basis of assessments that are essentially there to assess something like intelligence. Yes, but that is part of the controversy. Is it reasonable? And this is a measurement issue. And that's why I've been instructing you to some degree in psychometrics, because we actually know how to do this. We know how to answer that question. So let's take a look at how intelligence has been assessed and why, and then you can make up your own mind. Anyways, here's some of the examples of other forms of intelligence. And so then the question is, well, what does it mean to have a different form of intelligence? Would form A and form B be completely uncorrelated? Like extroversion, say, and neuroticism, or would they be slightly correlated, or would they be highly correlated? And then you might ask, well, how highly correlated do they have to be before they're the same thing? Or how uncorrelated do they have to be before they're different things? And actually the answer to that comes down to something like practical utility. It's like, imagine I'm trying to figure out how well you'll do in university. And I measure one thing, and it's correlated at 0.7 with another thing I measure about you. Then I might say, well, are those two things the same or different? They're pretty highly correlated. You're high in one, it means you're going to be high in the other. Well, so is there any utility in measuring both things? And the way you figure that out actually is you do it statistically. So we take the target, which might be your performance across university, and then we say, well, can we predict your performance across university better by using one variable or two variables? So we would enter them both into a regression equation. All a regression equation does, it's quite simple. So you're trying to predict the target, and the regression equation tells you how well you can predict that target if you know another fact. Now then it gets a little complicated, because that's a correlation. How well you can predict B with A. Well, a regression will say how much you can predict C if you know A and B, or A and B and C and D and E, because you can use multiple predictors, and you can weight them. So it might be 2 times A plus 1 times B equals C. And that's all a regression equation does. It's just multiplication and addition. Very, very straightforward. And so two variables are sufficiently different functionally if you can use both of them simultaneously to predict something of interest. So again, it's a tool-like approach. This is how the psychometricians do it. Is something real? Well, it's real if you can measure it and it helps you predict. That's how it's defined. So then you might say, well, are there these multiple intelligences? Well, the first question would be, well, what do you mean by are there? And the answer to that would be, well, let's specify the question, since we're going to be scientific about it.
Bill Clinton.
Let's predict how well people do in university. We'll start with the assumption that intelligence, if intelligence isn't associated with university success, then you're probably not talking about intelligence. Now, you could argue that, right? Because you could say, well, intelligence has nothing to do with university success. But that's a definitional matter. We'd have to agree to begin with. Is it reasonable to start with the presupposition that intelligence and university success share something in common? Well, I think you have to be daft to deny that initial proposition, although you could. Because you could say it was privilege or socioeconomic status or any number of sociological phenomena, and some of those are obviously relevant. Social class, for example. Because, you know, if you're in a higher social class, and all things being equal, intelligence included, if you're in a higher social class, you're more likely to go to university than you are if you're in a lower social class. So there's other factors that are going to influence whether or not you do well in university, but we're going to assume that one of them might be intelligence.
Let's assume.
Well, then you would ask, well,